Welcome to today's presentation, Augment Your Audits with InSpec 2.0. Let's go ahead and get started. Nick, why don't you kick us off by telling our audience what we'll be covering here today?
Hi, folks. This is Nick Rycar, Technical Product Marketing Manager here at Chefs, coming at you from my phone. And today we're going to be looking at InSpec 2.0. We'll start by giving a brief overview of InSpec itself for any folks that are new to bring everybody onto the same page. And then we'll dive into what is new in InSpec 2.0. We'll cover briefly how InSpec relates to Chef Automate and what extra features Automate users can expect to get out of InSpec. And finally, we'll close with a brief demonstration of some of the new cloud resources in InSpec 2.0. After that, we'll bring everything back for a quick recap and Q&A where we'll answer all of your questions. And a reminder, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask at any time, feel free to ask via the Q&A widget in the webinar dashboard. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So now a poll with some context. So before we dive in, I'd love to hear how you're using InSpec today. If you're not using it at all, no worries. There's an option for that, as well as some of the things that you can use InSpec for. I'm interested to see whether you're using InSpec and to what degree it's being used in your organization. We'll give that just a moment so that folks have time to log their answers, and then we'll move on along. All right. Okay, so it looks like a vast majority of folks are not yet using InSpec, and indeed you are in the right place. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about InSpec. What is it and why do you want to use it? And a lot of it comes back to some of the core principles of DevOps. So for folks unfamiliar, DevOps really boils down to enabling better collaboration between traditionally disparate teams. For development and operations, this meant taking old practices of developers handing off application artifacts to operations to deploy through disconnected systems and unifying those teams on a similar code base and tool set. With InSpec, we can do the same thing with our security and compliance colleagues by providing a unified language for different groups to use to enable them to all have the same source of truth for their shared responsibilities. So, for example, in a lot of auditing frameworks, we're talking, regulatory compliance here, starts with a fairly broad requirement that needs to be fulfilled. For example, here, a framework might ask that we have access control systems installed and enabled on our systems. Now, this can mean different things for different operating systems or even different flavors of the same operating system. So in InSpec, we take that requirement, we represent it as code. InSpec code allows us to describe things like packages that are installed. So in this case, SE Linux is an access control system that can be installed on our machines, and also allows us to create some metadata and impact ranking so that if we need to create a weighted report of all of the different security and compliance concerns we're responsible for, we can do so with the right level of granularity for whoever needs to be able to access and review that material. This is all part of a motion called continuous automation. This is a practice of being able to continuously automate and improve everything in the environments you manage, and consists of three distinct steps. Detect, getting visibility into what is currently running and whether or not what's there is in compliance with our requirements. Correct, applying any configuration or software changes that are needed to fulfill our requirements. And automate, make sure that both of these processes can be rerun on demand so that we don't spend time resolving issues that have already been solved in the past. You'll notice the first step here is detect, and that is a very conscious decision because until we have a target to hit, we never know whether or not we've actually fully complied with our requirements. So being able to define and validate those requirements is imperative to do as early as possible. We'll get into that in some more detail in a bit, but this is going to bring us to our second polling question. When does your organization evaluate new code for security? Now, this can be everything from a new deployment of applications that you create and manage, or just updates to environments from something like an operations team. Our options here: evaluating security ahead of a production deploy, doing it a little bit earlier in the phase during some pre-prod analysis, or continuously evaluating throughout the development cycle. All right. So it looks like the vast majority of folks joined in are doing it at some stage in pre-prod, with remaining folks doing it at either end of that process. And that's more or less in line with what I've seen working with our customers in the field. And really, it comes down to thinking about when we are evaluating the security of our systems. And traditionally, this happens fairly late in the process, sometimes between staging and production, or QA and staging. And the imperative here is to start moving this process earlier and earlier in the production cycle. Why? Well, the later that we identify potential issues, the greater impact they can have in all aspects of our organization, whether it means potentially having to pull back a scheduled production release in order to review, or in some cases where security vulnerabilities or failures are prioritized and determined that are non-impactful enough that they are safe enough to move to production. And a lot of times where we see industries that have been hit by security flaws and vulnerabilities, those have been known issues. They're not necessarily zero day, but either haven't been captured or haven't been prioritized to enable the production timeline that's been put in play. By continuously evaluating our compliance, we have the ability to capture issues as early as possible, where they can be changed and addressed before they are endangering our production timeline. InSpec is a language and framework that allows us to do this by applying consistent checks to any environment we manage, be it a local development environment all the way through to production, and get consistent feedback wherever we're running it. So a quick example from one of our customers, New Solutions. So they have a challenge where they offer managed services to a variety of regulated industries. And for those industries, the ability to move fast is often at odds with the ability to ensure that that regulatory compliance is met. By working with Chef to automate compliance evaluation, they've been able to reduce the time spent checking compliance by a whopping 93%. Not only is this great time savings, it means when we come into an audit, we already know how that audit's going to shake out, because we're not only checking our compliance when the auditors are at our door, but always, so that we know as soon as a change might endanger our compliance, we can address and evaluate without that becoming a ticking time bomb for later on. And as John Williams, CTO at New, told us, once something's built and handed over, they already know it's compliant because it's been evaluated via this continuous compliance process. Now, when it comes to what's new in InSpec 2.0, there's a lot of new features and capabilities now at our disposal. One of the biggest ones is the ability to evaluate cloud configurations. So up until now, InSpec has primarily been used to evaluate servers, be they bare metal servers or VMs. We are logging into something or connecting over SSH or WinRM and taking a look at the running state of that system. For organizations that have adopted the cloud, however, this isn't sufficient to validate everything that we need to be aware of. Many of the services and capabilities of the cloud don't live on servers. They're managed services provided by those cloud providers. With these new resources, we have the ability to evaluate both the application services and packages that we've installed on servers, as well as our cloud services, things like data storage and access control. There's an improved out-of-the-box experience, so even if we are inspecting traditional systems, we have augmented library of resources that we can use to evaluate them. Things like configuration parsers, so that we can look through commonly used configuration files and address their configurations without having to write configuration-specific regular expressions to accomplish it. And finally, a big one for me is drastically improved performance. 30% on Linux and Unix systems and a whopping 90% on Windows systems. So if you've used InSpec before and were frustrated at how long it was taking for compliance reports to get generated, we've got good news for you. Now, before we move on, one last poll question. Are you familiar with the shared responsibility model? And as with our first question, I don't know is a perfectly valid answer. We will be covering it briefly. All right. So, looks like about a 50-50 split between folks that have heard of it but are unfamiliar or that are familiar with it. The shared responsibility model is something that has come into prominence from cloud providers, helping delineate where your cloud provider's responsibility ends and where yours begins. A good high-level way to summarize it is that your provider is responsible for the security of the cloud, whereas you, the end user and customer, are responsible for the security in the cloud. So while they are responsible for making sure that their services are inherently secure, you are still responsible for making sure that you configure those services in a secure way. And of course, for any of the applications, et cetera, you manage on servers are secured similar to how they would be on-prem or in VMs. And with that, we really see where the cloud configuration verification enabled by InSpec 2.0 becomes very powerful. Being able to evaluate things like our security groups, like our networking and block storage is crucial, and indeed is often a vector for security flaws. Things like unprotected storage buckets that we need to ensure are not publicly accessible. We can validate now with InSpec to ensure that they don't become the way that our data could be put in jeopardy. So for a quick example, right now our cloud resources are supporting Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. And here we see an example of evaluating an Azure security group. We are defining that's fun. So looks like my slide deck got a little bit malformed in the resource block here. So that big blank space between describe and do should have an example of our Azure generic resource there, where we're taking a look at a particular security group and expecting that it is in the appropriate location, that it is not tagged, and of course that its provisioning state has succeeded. It exists. For another example, goodness gracious. All right, so looks like my font here also removed the resource name. No worries, when we do our demo, I'll have some example code so we can see the full output here. But in this case, we're taking a look at an Amazon S3 bucket. This is the aforementioned data storage service that Amazon offers. And in particular, we're making sure not only that our bucket exists, but that it is not publicly exposed and has access logging enabled so that we can audit who has been accessing that particular data. Again, if we compare this with running things on premises, typically doing things like data storage requires configuration of complex devices, your SAN, NAS systems, which you no longer have to do in the cloud. But even within those cloud frameworks, we need to make sure that they are configured securely for our purposes. As mentioned, there are a ton of new application level resources. So this is some of the feature augmentation we were talking about in the summary slide. And these include things like being able to evaluate Docker containers that are running, different types of configurations, like for web servers or databases. And in all of these cases, what we have is the ability to reference the contents of these configurations as simple key value pairs. So I mentioned this briefly earlier, but for things like MySQL, Apache, Nginx, IIS, they have their own configuration formats. And traditionally evaluating these required that we are familiar with how those configuration files are formatted so that we can write code that inspects it and makes sure things are properly configured. What these resources enable us to do is to only worry about the content. Do we have the right configuration parameters set, and reference them as a simple key value pair so that regardless of what specific syntax is in use in any of those configurations, we don't need to parse that directly. The InSpec resources are going to do that for us, and we only need to concern ourselves with what variables and attributes should be set within those configurations. Now, for users of Chef Automate, we have some augmented features for InSpec, including the ability to take InSpec profiles and create from them compliance reports. These will go ahead and run a collection of these rules that we've seen examples of, and whether they be a couple dozen or a few thousand, we can aggregate those so that we can get across our environment a clear picture of where our audits are failing, the severity of those failures, and can inspect everything from that high-level summary all the way down to the individual control-by-control details. Automate users also have access to a library of built-in baselines for some standard compliance frameworks, including things like the Center for Internet Security's benchmarks, as well as DISA STIG. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get ready to share my screen, and we'll see a quick demonstration of those cloud resources we've been talking about. And for that, go ahead. There's my share screen window. Always fun when there's a little console lag. Spoiler alert, clear things out. But folks now should be seeing the bright blue screen of my terminal, where I am going to be looking at a few of the InSpec demos I've created for this webinar. Now, to kick things off, we have this AWS demo profile. And InSpec profile, the things that we're looking to address are collected in what are called controls. I can evaluate those controls by running the InSpec command line utility, and in particular, the InSpec exec command. I'm going to define which controls I want to run, so I'm going to go into the controls directory of my AWS demo, and we'll have a look at IAM, my access management. And typically, when you run InSpec exec, we're giving it a target, something that we can reach over either on our local system or over SSH or WinRM, but we can also target things like our cloud. Here, my credentials are stored in a local credentials file, so I don't need to specify them here. It's authenticating to AWS and checking my IAM user and Rycar. It should and does exist, and because I want to make sure that only I access it, I'm confirming that I have multi-factor authentication enabled, so that it does require me to authenticate with my phone, fob, what have you, in order to get into my account. Another example, we talked a lot about evaluating storage buckets. And indeed, I'm using S3 on Amazon. I have some buckets that are meant to be public, and I do want to be publicly accessible, and others that I want to make sure are private. Here, I'm evaluating a couple of my buckets in US West 2, where the BJC public should be public, and indeed it is, whereas my private bucket, PJC admins, should not be public and is only accessible to administrators in my account. Finally, one last check in my AWS rules here is a quick security group check. So this is another feature in Amazon where I can create virtual private cloud networks and create security groups that define access within them. Again, for some of my demos, I have some security groups that are very permissive in their access. They're only used on ephemeral demo instances. So in this case, my all open group does exist and is associated with the right VPC, we can actually see here where there are multiple security groups that should exist on a particular VPC. I have the ability to check all of those and make sure that my VPC is configured as I expect it to be. And of course, things wouldn't be complete without an Azure example of same. So I have launched a VM to my Azure account here so that I can do another quick and simple validation on that. This time I've only got one control control file here, my default set of controls. And this time I'm going to use the Azure target. As before, I store my Azure credentials locally, so that's what's being used to authenticate. And here we actually see an example of a failure. Don't worry, I planned for this. So here we're taking a look at one of my Azure machines and validating that it has the right OS, it has the right computer name, my Rycar test machine. It was published by Microsoft Windows Server and is running the version of Windows I expect, 2016 Data Center. However, it was expecting a standard DS2 V2 size instance, whereas I spun up a standard DS1 because I didn't want to spend as much money. In order to go ahead and either change my VM if this is indeed valid, or as is the case here, I actually do want a DS1 instance, I can go ahead and update that default control to tell it what to properly expect there, since I am totally fine with that being a DS1 instance. So, as promised, here is an example of one of these controls that does not beholden to my font choices in my PowerPoint deck. And here we see where I've defined all of these expectations. And indeed, where I'm currently checking for DS2, I'm actually totally fine with it being DS1. And as long as my expectation matches what is actually running out in Azure, I now get a clean bill of health from my profile. And while I did say this was going to be primarily a review of the cloud resources, I did mention one thing in the updated resources that isn't technically a straight up server investigation, and that's some Docker resources. So I've actually got some Docker containers running on my system here, and indeed can use a set of Docker resources to evaluate those as well. So we actually have a Docker demo here. If we take a look at the simple control I'm running here, we're going to evaluate one of our containers, this CD6 container, making sure that it exists, is running, and that it is running from the proper image and Rycar National Parks. We've already sort of looked at it in Docker PS, so I can see that that stuff is true, but if I'm running a lot of stuff and I'm not going to be manually evaluating all of it, well, just like before, I just need to do an InSpec exec on that profile. And this time, because I'm evaluating a container running on my local system, I don't need to specify my transport. It's just going to look for my currently running containers. And indeed, that container does exist, is running, and has the image I expect in place. So that's our quick and dirty overview of some of the new features and resources in InSpec. And of course, all of this is code that we'll be sharing out after the demo is complete. I have it hosted on GitHub. So if you want to go ahead and take a spin and evaluate it against your own running cloud systems or Docker containers, you have the ability to do that. Of course, you'll just need to update things like, you're probably not going to be looking for Rycar National Park. But that is all easy enough to change within our profiles as we saw in the Azure example. Let me go ahead and stop my screen share now, hop back into our presentation view for a quick recap before we go into some Q&A. So, InSpec itself, its purpose is to unify compliance, security, DevOps, etc., so that everyone has a consistent source of truth for how environments are evaluated, as well as a unified means to assess current compliance or non-compliance with those requirements. InSpec 2.0 brings things further by allowing us a lot of extra ways that we can use InSpec by evaluating things like our cloud configurations or Docker containers, as well as providing that additional library of extra configuration resources for all of the day-to-day functional testing or compliance evaluation you might need to do. And for users of Chef Automate, we can formalize this further by taking that InSpec data and generating a formal compliance report so that we have an up-to-the-minute view of how compliant all of the systems we manage are, filterable by their environment, by their severity, and ultimately gives us a single source to look to figure out how we need to prioritize and execute remediation. Since we're evaluating these things continuously, when we apply those configurations, we get real-time feedback as to whether or not they actually solved the problems that brought us there in the first place by running those same InSpec audits and confirming that we do indeed get successful results after making the appropriate changes. And with that, I'm going to run down some of the Q&A questions that have been coming in as I've been talking here. So let's go ahead and start from the start here. First question is for some clarification on the impact ranking of our InSpec controls. So it is a scale from 0 to 1, the decimal scale, so 0.0 to 1.0. And I believe when we are generating those compliance reports, anything from, I believe it's 0.0 to 0.3 or 0.4, I'd have to look at our docs, is minor. In between those and 0.7 are major, and 0.7 to 1 are critical. So let's see here. So how can InSpec help us with evaluating Amazon RDS, which if folks are not familiar, that is a database service that Amazon offers, which much like what we were talking about with S3 buckets, allows us to host a database without needing to host it on a server. As with our other concerns, though, that means that we no longer have a server to SSH to if we need to evaluate our instances. So this would be controlled by those cloud resources. Right now, those resources do not yet include RDS specifically, although that is logged as a roadmap issue on the project right now. And if you're curious, InSpec is an open source tool. So if you're curious about what is currently in the source code or what features are being evaluated, we can go ahead and take a look on GitHub to take a look at that development cycle as it comes in live. So one question here is, what's the difference between Trusted Advisor and InSpec checks? So Trusted Advisor is a cloud-specific service that can go in and evaluate the running configuration of your cloud content. There is definitely some overlap in the purpose here. The biggest difference is in the scope, where Trusted Advisor is specific to, I believe it's AWS, and is not something that could potentially be applied across different clouds or to your on-premises environments, whereas InSpec is defined to be platform agnostic. Unless we need to evaluate something that is specific to our cloud provider, we can use those same InSpec rules, whether they be on-prem, Amazon, Azure, and beyond. Does this cost anything? Great question. So InSpec itself is open source. So you can go ahead and download and run InSpec today with no cost attached. What is an enterprise feature is Chef Automate. So the dashboard, the CIS and STIG compliance profiles, as well as the ability to generate those in-browser reports are all part of our enterprise platform that is licensed by the size of the environment that we're looking to assess. how does InSpec check that the bucket is public? So this is actually going in and making use of the Amazon APIs. So this would be similar to if we were either looking at our bucket in the GUI and the permissions tab there, or running the AWS CLI utilities to directly reference that API. As with things like our configuration file examples, the InSpec resources are built in with understanding of how to parse those and can distill the different requirements down to simple yes or no questions. And actually, I'm going to briefly share my screen again here real quick just to show off. And actually, let me make sure I have my desktop set up right for it here. But how you'd actually find out what options are available to you in any of these resources. So go ahead and have a quick look here at the InSpec.io documentation here. And actually, I've already filtered down to some of the cloud-specific resources. So if we wanted to look at, for example, what sorts of things we can evaluate in AWS S3 bucket, we can take a look here for some syntax references, as well as a list of all the properties and matchers that can be used within a particular resource. In this case, those matchers are the actual evaluations that we're looking to do. So here we see some examples of things like whether or not the bucket is public. And indeed, this actually provides some of the more granular answer to that question, which defines explicitly what that means. ACL grants access to all users, authorized users, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll go ahead and stop the share again and see what else we have in the Q&A. Can I use AWS profiles instead of my default AWS credentials file? So when it comes to authentication here, you can provide it with a specific configuration to use rather than the default credentials file. If you have things that are already sort of no-auth enabled, like if you're using IAM roles, I believe you should be able to use it without defining anything beyond that. You can also define credentials via command line flags directly if you don't have that in a local configuration. Let's see here. Goodness gracious. Lots of questions today. Can it also be used for performing a chaos experiment? I love this question. So generally speaking, yes. In pretty much any scenario where you need to get a true or false validation against an expectation is something that you can use InSpec for. And that's actually a great point because I brought this up in the context of compliance, which generally you think of as things like formal regulatory compliance, your PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP, what have you. But ultimately, this is any kind of evaluation. So whether we're talking about your own internal compliance, things like ensuring that you don't have any known vulnerabilities active in your system, or even just functional testing of environments, those are all cases that fit that same schema, and InSpec can be used regardless. See what else we have here. How can I use this with Jenkins or another CI? Great question. So ultimately, there are a lot of different ways to invoke InSpec. So the quick answer is it depends. The little bit more detailed answer is that, what it depends on is sort of how you're evaluating your systems today. So for example, if we're talking about sort of the test phase of things, there is a tool in the Chef development kit called Test Kitchen that can be used to spin up an ephemeral VM or environment, run our configuration updates to those temporary test nodes, and has built-in support for using InSpec as a validator so that we can use it right off the bat to test our pre-fraud systems. But because it has that command line utility and can actually be run as part of a Chef client run, if you're using Chef to configure your systems, anywhere that you might do those evaluations is a place that you can potentially insert InSpec. As long as that utility is available or Chef is in use, you have the ability to slot in InSpec tests at any part of a pipeline. Could I integrate InSpec with Puppet? So very kind of similar concern here, but the short answer is yes. In particular, if we take a look at something like Test Kitchen, Test Kitchen by default will use Chef to configure machines, but has plugins for other configuration management utilities. And whatever we're actually using to correct in our environment, we can use InSpec to detect. When it comes to evaluating live environments, the nice thing is, because we have the ability to do those agentless scans over SSH or WinRM, we do not need the Chef client specifically to be in use. So if you're not using Chef for CM, you can absolutely still use InSpec to execute these profiles, and even use Chef Automate, which allows you to schedule recurring agentless scans from the UI without requiring machines to be bootstrapped with Chef as a prerequisite. If machines are bootstrapped with Chef, you can still run InSpec via a supermarket cookbook, a publicly available cookbook called Audit, that will run InSpec at the end of every Chef client run and send that data back to Chef Automate if it's in use. Can we formulate InSpec output to JSON? Yes, you can. What we were seeing in my live example there was our default reporting format, which is, I believe, called documentation. It just gives a nice human-readable and color-highlighted summary. We can totally export that into JSON, I believe XML as well, and reports can be downloaded as CSV. So whatever format that you need to use to import those results should be achievable with InSpec. Is InSpec 2.0 included in the Chef DK? So at the time of this recording, no. Latest Chef DK is, I believe, on InSpec 1.5. Doesn't mean that you can't make use of these features. There are a few extra ways to do it. It will, of course, be added in future releases of the Chef DK, so you will see that in short order. If you are hungry to get familiar with some of these new resources and want to use it with existing things, you have a couple of options. If you are using InSpec 1.5, a lot of these cloud resources are actually available to you via some public profiles. There is an InSpec AWS and an InSpec Azure profile where initial development of these features was done and can be used with InSpec 1.5, provided that you depend on those within your profile. So InSpec has an ability to define upstream dependencies. Otherwise, if you don't want to worry about setting up dependencies, InSpec can be installed directly via a number of means. It's released as a Ruby gem, so if you have Ruby on your system, you can go ahead and do a gem install to get latest InSpec. It's also, as with many of Chef's utilities, available via an OmniTruck installer. Basically, copy-paste a command into your terminal, and I'll go ahead and install it for you. It's also released via Brew on Mac OS, and I believe there is a Windows equivalent as well, but I won't get into specifics there without getting myself into trouble. It's also released as a Habitat package, which is, without getting too deep into the weeds there, a Chef tool that is used to package and deploy applications and services. So we can use Habitat to install things on our local machines, inside containers, on VMs, pretty much wherever we need it. So let's see. There are a couple other questions on the free versus paid, which I believe we covered. However, there was a question here as to whether there is a limited trial version of the enterprise solution. So as mentioned, InSpec itself, open source and free to use. If you would like to evaluate Chef Automate, there are a number of ways to do so. Probably the easiest to just get quick, up and running, and hands-on is via our learning resources, learn.chefs.io. There is a Taste of Automate track that will actually let you run a pared-down version of Automate right on your local system, on your laptop or desktop in a container to get a feel for the workflow. There are also a variety of options to try out Automate, including on Amazon, they have OWCA, or OpsWorks for Chef Automate, which can allow you to evaluate Automate as a Amazon managed service from within your account. And of course, if you are self-installing Automate, there are still trial options. That same learn.chef site has a number of Automate tutorials that will walk you through the process of getting a temporary license for use wherever you'd like to install it. Let's see here. So does InSpec have the capability of running tests on AWS instances, OS-specific tests? Absolutely yes. So the core resource library that existed from launch is built for just this purpose, where resources are defined to capture sort of common things that you might need to evaluate within a running system. What packages are installed, what services are running, what files and directories exist, et cetera, et cetera. As with Chef, these resources are defined to be relatively platform agnostic, so that you can use similar resources regardless of what operating system you're running on, with the caveat that there are certain features and functionalities that are specific to a particular operating system. So if you needed to evaluate something Windows-specific, like a registry key, there's an InSpec resource that you can use that directly. Or if you just need to go ahead and look at a file or directory, well, it's a universal resource that can be used regardless of platform. See what else we've got. How difficult is it to integrate InSpec into an existing Ansible environment? So again, very similar to the Puppet question earlier, and pretty much same response, especially since if we're looking at something like Ansible, which is generally run agentlessly by default, one of the big blockers for folks evaluating Chef tools has been that agent. Since InSpec is able to be run agentless, it's very easy to integrate into existing environments. In that what it is evaluating is not specific to how something was configured. It's simply taking a look at current running state. So if I want to make sure Apache is running, I can do that regardless of whether I installed it by hand, via Ansible Puppet Chef, or any other utility. Let's see here. So another question here, and we covered this a little bit. So the question is whether InSpec can be used to run a formal audit for, say, PCI, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, things like that. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. Not all compliance frameworks are created equal. Some, like the aforementioned DISA STIG, are very prescriptive on what specifically is being checked within environments, whereas some frameworks have more open-ended requirements that you then need to validate with your auditor. A way that I've talked about it with my colleagues internally is that a lot of these frameworks are like defending your dissertation as opposed to taking a test with a pre-written answer key. In either case, InSpec can help you make that case by translating whatever your requirements are into InSpec code and using that with your auditors to help validate how you have accomplished whichever requirements are being evaluated, and that you've accomplished it on every machine in your purview, so that you have consistent results across your environments. I assume this question was about one of the poll questions. Why isn't there a what's a security evaluation option for when we were asking how you use InSpec today? Fair point. So in this case, right, a security evaluation like a compliance evaluation is something that is often defined by each individual organization and really is just a catch-all for how and if you are evaluating whether or not you're vulnerable to known vulnerabilities, 0 days, et cetera, whether things are securely configured, and so forth. The biggest difference between doing that as formal compliance via an organizational standard, of course, is whether or not something has already been defined. Whereas our organizations that are not beholden to specific compliance frameworks are often responsible for defining those requirements themselves. And that's actually something where InSpec becomes very useful because with things like the CIS benchmarks that we talked about earlier, they provide a fairly robust baseline for security that can be used whether or not you are beholden to anything specific, and particularly useful for organizations that have not yet defined the specifics of their security evaluations. It essentially solves what I call the blank canvas problem, where if I don't know what needs to be evaluated, I don't even know where to start. Whereas I can go ahead and run a CIS audit, run a DSIS-BIG audit, get reports back, and when I see what passes or fails in my environment, I then have the ability to prioritize which of those are important to my organization and either remediate or not according to those priorities. But you can't solve what you don't know. So let's see here. A couple more questions about pricing and the Chef DK. Are these infrastructure resources supported by Test Kitchen? So to put a finer point on it, yes, anything you can do with InSpec can be done in Test Kitchen. As with my examples using the command line utility, we would just need to tell Test Kitchen which profiles we want to run. It's definable within the kitchen.yaml, its configuration file. And the InSpec verifier is now default out of the box if you do a Chef Generate cookbook via the Chef DK. Let's see here. Can I do a loop? Short answer, yes. So as with Chef, InSpec is configuration as code and can do sort of your standard code evaluation, conditionals, loops, et cetera, as part of the process. And actually, another great point, I brought up an example a moment ago about running one of these profiles even if you're not beholden to that specific framework. And in those cases, you might actually come back with failures that aren't actually pertinent or germane to your particular organization. Via InSpec dependencies that we were talking about a little bit earlier, we can actually pull in and selectively enable or disable specific controls so that without having to go in and rewrite the hundreds of controls that are part of a CIS benchmark, we can go ahead and say, pull in all of those controls, but skip 1, 2, and 5, which I don't care about. So that we don't need to reinvent the wheel if we want just a subset of something that's already been written. Is there another way to target an AWS environment than the CLI? And that's another one that really depends on the specifics of how we would want to evaluate. The transport they're using, that -T AWS, is essentially connecting to the API via a plugin that can interface with it. But we can also run things directly on the infrastructure that we have. So if we're talking about the environment metadata itself or services that aren't housed in servers, then yep, using that sort of AWS transport is the way to do it. If we're talking about, metadata within a instance in AWS, Azure, what have you, we can target those directly via SSH or WinRM as well as via things like the Chef client and any of the data that is directly available to us on that machine is something that we can validate. Does Chef InSpec stay up to date as far as new vulnerabilities are concerned? So this is a great question, and the short answer is that InSpec itself, as far as the tool, is not directly aware of vulnerabilities. That comes from the profiles that are being executed with it. And so while we do produce a lot of vulnerability detection, as well as our community has created a bunch of InSpec profiles that are available on the Chef Supermarket, ultimately you can validate things as soon as they are identified, but would need to write an InSpec control to validate. So some good examples, I have done a number of demonstrations using the Poodle vulnerability as an example. If you're not familiar, Poodle is a vulnerability in SSL, the secure communication over the internet, and the nature of the problem was that SSL version 3 had a potential exploit that could be used to grab plain text content of ostensibly secure data. With InSpec, it's very easy to use a provided resource. There's an SSL resource that we can use to go ahead and evaluate any ports that are listening on SSL and inspect which protocols are in use. So if we wanted to directly enforce only TLS 1.2, which is generally the preferred solution to the Poodle problem, we can go ahead and write that in a single 3-line control and start evaluating it directly. And as we are coming towards the end of the hour here, I'd like to pass the baton back to Jamie to cover some final odds and ends before we close out.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And one last thing I'd like to share with our audience is that ChefConf 2018 is coming up this May. And we invite you to join us in Chicago the 22nd through 25th to continue the conversation with chefs and InSpec experts and community members. As a thank you to our live audience for your participation today, we'd like to share some InSpec swag with you. So be on the lookout for an email from us tomorrow with a link to claim the InSpec swag of your choice. For those of you that submitted questions that we didn't have time to answer, we'll follow up with you via email and address those in the next week or so on the Chef blog, where we'll recap everything we covered here today. As a reminder, a copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list widget at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to download the slide deck and bookmark any links that you may find useful. We, of course, hope you found value in the information that Nick presented today. And if you like what you saw, we encourage you to share the recorded presentation with your teammates or professional networks. The on-demand version should be available by tomorrow, and we'll email you as soon as it's ready, along with the discount code to register for ChefConf. So thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.